The blood-stained envelope arrived on the same day. Rebecca Keller buried her last shred of hope that Thomas might still be alive. Carried by a Union courier who looked far too young to have witnessed the horrors written across his haunted eyes. Rebecca stood on the porch of the small ranch house outside Gila City, Arizona. The September sun of 1867 beating down mercilessly as she stared at the paper in her trembling hands. The courier had already ridden away, leaving her alone with this final piece of her husband. She could see Thomas's handwriting on the front, the familiar loops and curves that had once penned love letters during their courtship. But now the ink seemed faded, the paper weathered, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever words lay inside would break her heart completely. She sank onto the wooden steps, her black mourning dress collecting dust, and tried to make sense of the letters swimming before her eyes. Rebecca had never learned to read properly. Growing up in a poor farming family in Missouri, she had spent her childhood working the fields rather than attending the schoolhouse. Thomas had known this about her, had promised to teach her when the war ended, had written her letters anyway during his deployment knowing she would find someone to read them aloud. But this letter, this final message from beyond the grave, felt too intimate to share with anyone in town. The words blurred together, meaningless shapes that mocked her ignorance. She pressed the letter to her chest and let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Thomas had been dead for 3 months, killed at a skirmish she had never heard of, in a war that had technically ended 2 years ago but still claimed lives in the scattered violence that plagued the reuniting nation. She had received the official notification 6 weeks earlier, but holding this letter made it devastatingly real. Rebecca did not know how long she sat there, clutching the unopened letter, tears streaming down her face. The sun had moved considerably across the sky when she finally heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She quickly wiped her eyes and stood, smoothing her dress, trying to compose herself. Out here, 20 miles from town, visitors were rare and often brought trouble. The rider who came into view was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. He wore dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but as he drew closer and removed the hat in a gesture of respect, Rebecca saw he was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and respectful, "name is Marcus Yates. I am looking for the Keller Ranch. Been told in town this might be the place." Rebecca straightened her spine, trying to look more composed than she felt. "This is the Keller Ranch. I am Rebecca Keller." "What is your business here?" Marcus dismounted, moving with a grace that suggested he was accustomed to physical labor. Up close, Rebecca could see he had kind eyes, a warm brown that seemed to hold both strength and gentleness. "I served with your husband, madam, Thomas Keller. I was with him when he died." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, and Marcus moved forward instinctively, reaching out to steady her, though he stopped short of actually touching her. "Maybe we should sit down," he suggested gently. Rebecca nodded mutely and sank back onto the porch steps. Marcus sat a respectful distance away, holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "Thomas talked about you constantly," Marcus began, his voice soft. "About this ranch, about the life you two were building. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would come here, make sure you were all right. I am sorry it took me so long. I was recovering from my own wounds, and then I had to track down where exactly this ranch was located." "He wrote me a letter," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "It arrived today. I have been sitting here for hours, and I cannot." She trailed off, embarrassment flooding through her. She did not know this man, did not want to reveal her shame to a stranger. But Marcus seemed to understand immediately. His expression softened with compassion, not pity. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Rebecca felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. She looked down at the letter still clutched in her hand, then back at this stranger who had kind eyes and had known her husband. "Yes," she breathed. "Please." She held out the envelope with shaking hands. Marcus took it carefully, as though it were made of the most delicate glass. He opened it slowly, unfolding the pages inside with reverence. Rebecca watched his eyes move across the words, saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Dear Rebecca," he began, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. He cleared his throat and started again. "Dear Rebecca, if you are reading this, then I have not made it home to you, and for that I am sorrier than words can express. I am writing this on the eve of what might be our final engagement, and I need you to know certain things in case I do not get the chance to tell you in person." Marcus paused, glancing at Rebecca, whose tears were already flowing freely. He shifted slightly closer to her on the steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without them actually touching. "You have been the greatest joy of my life," he continued reading. "From the moment I saw you at the harvest dance in 1863, with your dark hair gleaming in the lantern light and your laugh ringing out across the barn, I knew I wanted to spend every remaining day of my life making you happy. Our wedding day remains the finest day I have ever known, and the months we had together before I enlisted are treasured memories I carry with me always." Rebecca let out a soft sob, remembering that dance, that wedding, those precious few months before the war had torn them apart. She felt Marcus pause in his reading, felt him shift even closer, and suddenly his arm was around her shoulders, solid and warm and comforting. She leaned into him without thinking, needing the human contact, the support of another person who had cared about Thomas. "I know this war has been hard on you," Marcus read on, his voice steady despite the emotion in it. "I know you have been running the ranch alone, dealing with difficulties I can only imagine. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Rebecca, and I have complete faith in your ability to build a good life, even without me. But I need you to know that you should not mourn me forever. You are young, only 24, and you have so much life ahead of you. I want you to live it fully. I want you to find happiness again, even if that happiness is with someone else." "No," Rebecca whispered brokenly. "No, I cannot." Marcus tightened his arm around her slightly, offering comfort, and continued reading. "I know you will resist this idea. I know your loyal heart, my darling. But please, for me, do not lock yourself away in grief. This ranch needs a strong hand to run it, and you deserve a partner to share the burden and the joys. Do not be afraid to open your heart again. Love is not a finite resource that can be used up. The love we shared will always be part of you, but that does not mean there is no room for new love to grow." Rebecca was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. Marcus set the letter down carefully on his lap and turned toward her, using both arms now to hold her as she wept. She buried her face against his shoulder, not caring that she barely knew him, knowing only that she needed this human warmth, this solid presence, or she might shatter into 1,000 pieces. "I have asked my good friend Marcus Yates to check on you," Marcus read, his voice very close to her ear now. "He is a good man, one of the finest I have known. If he has made the journey to find you, then you can trust him completely. Marcus is from Wyoming originally, a rancher himself before the war. He knows horses and cattle, knows the land and how to work it. If you need help with the ranch, you could not ask for a better man." Rebecca felt Marcus's body tense slightly as he read his own name, felt his hesitation before he continued. "More than that, Rebecca, Marcus is kind and honest and decent. He is the sort of man who will treat you with the respect and tenderness you deserve. I am not suggesting anything improper, you understand. I am simply saying that if, in time, you find yourself drawn to him or to any good man, you should not feel guilty. You should not feel like you are betraying my memory. I want you to be happy, my love. I want you to live and laugh and love again. That would honor me far more than a lifetime of mourning." The words hung in the air between them. Rebecca could feel Marcus's chest rising and falling with his breath, could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She pulled back slightly to look up at him and saw that his own eyes were damp with tears. "There is a bit more," he said quietly, looking down at the letter again. "Tell Marcus I am counting on him to look after you. Tell him he has my blessing and my gratitude. And Rebecca, my darling wife, know that I will love you beyond death and beyond time. You made my life worth living, and I will carry that gift with me into whatever comes next. Be happy, my love. Be strong. Be open to the possibilities that life still holds. With all my heart, Thomas." The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca stared at Marcus through her tears, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, with strong features and those kind brown eyes. But more than that, there was something solid about him, something trustworthy. She could see the grief in his face, the genuine sorrow for a friend lost, and she knew Thomas had been right about him. "He gave you an impossible task," she whispered. "How can anyone look after me when I do not even know how to survive this?" Marcus carefully folded the letter and handed it back to her. "One day at a time," he said simply. "And you do not have to do it alone. Thomas asked me to help you, and I would like to honor that request. If you will allow me, I can stay on for a while, help get the ranch in order for the winter. No obligations, no expectations. Just one person helping another because it is the right thing to do." Rebecca looked toward the barn, the corrals, the vast expanse of Arizona territory stretching out around them. The ranch was struggling. She could not deny that. She had been managing alone since Thomas left nearly 2 years ago, but it was a constant battle. The cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and she was exhausted down to her bones. The thought of accepting help was both terrifying and intensely appealing. "I do not have much to offer in terms of wages," she said finally, her practical side asserting itself despite her emotional turmoil. "I do not need wages," Marcus replied. "I have saved my army pay and I am not hurting for money. I just need a place to be for a while, a purpose. Let me help you, Rebecca. Let me keep my promise to Thomas." She studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "There is a bunkhouse behind the barn. It is not much, but it is clean and dry. You are welcome to stay there as long as you need." Relief washed over Marcus's features. "Thank you. I will not let you down." They sat there for a few more minutes, neither speaking, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Rebecca felt wrung out, emotionally exhausted, but also somehow lighter. For the first time since receiving news of Thomas's death, she felt like she might actually survive this grief. The letter had been devastating to hear, but Thomas's words had also been a kind of permission, a release from the guilt she had been feeling about wanting to go on living. Finally, Marcus stood and offered her his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His hand was calloused and strong, the hand of a working man, and she felt a small flutter of something in her chest that she immediately pushed away. It was too soon, far too soon for anything like that. "Let me show you the bunkhouse," she said, stepping back and smoothing her dress again. "And then perhaps you can help me with the evening chores. The cattle need checking on." I would be happy to, Marcus said, settling his hat back on his head. As Rebecca led him around the house toward the barn, she clutched Thomas's letter close to her heart, feeling both the weight of her grief and the first small spark of something that might, eventually, become hope. The following days fell into a rhythm that surprised Rebecca with its ease. Marcus rose before dawn each morning and set about the ranch chores with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience. He repaired the sagging corral fence, cleaned out the water troughs, and spent long hours riding the range to check on the scattered cattle. He worked quietly, never asking for direction, but somehow knowing exactly what needed to be done. Rebecca found herself watching him sometimes from the kitchen window as she prepared meals. There was something comforting about having another person around, another presence to fill the emptiness that had settled over the ranch. She cooked for him, bringing meals out to wherever he was working, and they would sit together in companionable silence, eating and watching the desert landscape shimmer in the heat. It was not until the fourth day that they really talked. Marcus had been working on the windmill that pumped water from the well, and he came to the house at midday covered in dust and grease. Rebecca brought him a basin of water and a towel, and he cleaned up on the porch while she sat in the rocking chair Thomas had built for her during their brief time together. "You have kept this place running remarkably well," Marcus said as he dried his hands. "Thomas told me you were capable, but I did not fully appreciate what that meant. Most women in your position would have sold out and moved back to family." "I do not have family to move back to," Rebecca replied quietly. "My parents died of cholera when I was 16. My brother went to California during the gold rush and I have not heard from him in 5 years. This ranch is all I have. Thomas and I built it together from nothing. I cannot give it up." Marcus nodded, settling into the chair beside hers. "Tell me about how you two started this place." And so Rebecca found herself talking, the words flowing more easily than she had expected. She told him about how Thomas had claimed this land under the Homestead Act, how they had arrived with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and a handful of cattle. She described their first winter in a tent while Thomas built the house, board by board. She talked about the first calf born on their land, the first garden she had planted, the slow, hard work of building a life in this unforgiving territory. Marcus listened attentively, asking questions that showed he understood ranching, that he appreciated the challenges they had overcome. And then, hesitantly, Rebecca asked him about his own past. "I grew up in Wyoming," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and gazing out at the horizon. "My father had a ranch up there, beautiful country with real grass and streams that ran year-round. I was meant to take it over from him, but then the war came. My father was a Union man through and through, and I felt it was my duty to serve. I enlisted in 1862, figured I would be back in a year or two to resume my life." "What happened?" Rebecca asked softly. "The war lasted longer than anyone thought it would," Marcus said, "and when it finally ended I came home to find my parents both dead. Influenza took them in the winter of 1864. My younger sister had sold the ranch and moved east to live with our aunt. She sent me my share of the money, but the home I had been fighting to get back to was gone." Rebecca felt a pang of sympathy. "I am sorry." Marcus shrugged, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "I drifted for a while after that, not sure what to do with myself. I met Thomas during the final year of the war, and we became close friends. He talked about you and this ranch so much that I felt like I knew you both. When he asked me to promise I would check on you if anything happened to him, I was honored. And truthfully, I needed somewhere to go, something to do. I have been adrift since the war ended, looking for a purpose." "And have you found it?" Rebecca asked. "Here, I mean." Is this giving you the purpose you were looking for? Marcus turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Yes, he said simply. I think perhaps I have. They held eye contact for a long moment, and Rebecca felt something shift between them, something subtle but undeniable. She looked away first, her heart beating faster, confusion and guilt warring within her. It had only been days since she learned definitively of Thomas's death, since she heard his final letter. How could she possibly be feeling anything for another man already? As if sensing her turmoil, Marcus stood. I should get back to work on that windmill. Thank you for the meal and the conversation. Rebecca nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and watched him walk back toward the barn with long, purposeful strides. That evening, after the chores were done and dinner was finished, Marcus knocked on the door of the house. Rebecca answered to find him holding a worn book. I noticed you have some books on the shelf inside, he said, gesturing past her to the small collection visible through the doorway. Did they belong to Thomas? Yes, Rebecca said. He loved to read. He would sit by the fire in the evenings and read aloud to me sometimes. Poetry, mostly, and stories about far-off places. Marcus held up the book in his hands. I thought perhaps you might like to learn. To read, I mean. I know Thomas had planned to teach you. I could do that if you would like. In the evenings, after the work is done. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes again. It was such a thoughtful gesture, such a perfect way to honor Thomas's memory while also giving her something practical and valuable. I would like that very much, she said quietly. And so a new routine was established. Each evening after supper, Marcus would come to the house, and they would sit at the kitchen table by lamplight. He started with the basics, teaching her the alphabet, showing her how letters combine to make sounds and sounds combine to make words. He was patient and encouraging, never making her feel foolish for her struggles. Rebecca proved to be a quick learner. Her mind was sharp, hungry for knowledge, and she practiced diligently. Within 2 weeks, she could sound out simple words. Within a month, she could read basic sentences. Marcus brought her progressively more difficult texts, and she devoured them with enthusiasm. But it was not just the reading lessons that drew them together. As September turned to October and the Arizona heat finally began to ease, they spent more and more time simply talking. Marcus told her stories about the war, about the places he had seen, and the men he had known. Rebecca shared her dreams for the ranch, her plans for expansion once she could afford it. They discovered shared opinions on everything from politics to religion to the best way to train a horse. Rebecca found herself thinking about Marcus constantly. She noticed small things about him. The way he squinted when he smiled, the calluses on his hands, the gentle way he handled the animals. She caught herself watching for him to return from his work on the range, felt her heart lift when she heard his footsteps on the porch. And with each passing day, her guilt grew stronger. One evening in late October, after a particularly difficult reading lesson, Rebecca set down the book and looked at Marcus with troubled eyes. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, his face creasing with concern. "I feel like I am betraying Thomas," she whispered. "He has only been dead for 5 months, and here I am having these feelings for you. What kind of wife does that make me?" Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and solid. "It makes you human," he said gently. "Rebecca, grief does not follow a schedule. There is no proper timeline for these things. Thomas himself said he wanted you to be happy, to be open to new possibilities." "I know what he said," Rebecca replied, tears streaming down her face. "But knowing it in my head and feeling it in my heart are two different things. I loved him, Marcus. I loved him so much, and I still do." "I know you did," Marcus said, squeezing her hand. "And that love does not go away just because he is gone. But Thomas was right when he said love is not finite. Loving me, if that is what you are feeling, does not diminish what you had with him. It does not mean you love him any less. Is that what you are feeling? Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. Love, I mean, for me. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing slow circles on the back of her hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Yes. I have been fighting it, telling myself it is too soon, that you need time. But the truth is, I have been falling in love with you since the first day I arrived. You are strong and brave and beautiful, and being near you makes me feel like I have finally found the home I have been looking for. Rebecca let out a sob, and Marcus moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, still holding her hand. But I am not asking you for anything, he continued. I will wait as long as you need. Months, years, whatever it takes. I am not going anywhere. Rebecca looked down at him, at this good, patient man who had come into her life at her darkest moment and brought light back into it. She thought about Thomas's letter, his explicit blessing for her to find happiness again. She thought about how empty the ranch had felt before Marcus arrived and how full it felt now, and she made a decision. I do not want to wait, she said firmly. I do not want to waste time being afraid or feeling guilty. Thomas gave us his blessing, and life is too short and too uncertain to ignore that gift. I am falling in love with you too, Marcus, and I think we should stop fighting it. The smile that spread across Marcus's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. He reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch reverent. Are you certain? I am certain, Rebecca breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and sweet and full of promise. The kiss was everything Rebecca needed it to be. It was not a betrayal of her past, but an affirmation of her future. It was Marcus's patience and kindness made tangible, his steadfast presence transformed into something new and precious. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Rebecca saw her own joy reflected in Marcus's eyes. I love you, he said simply. I love you, she replied, and knew with absolute certainty that it was true. They courted properly after that, despite already living on the same property. Marcus continued to sleep in the bunkhouse, maintaining propriety, but they spent every possible moment together. He brought her wildflowers that grew in the desert, made her laugh with stories from his childhood, held her when the grief for Thomas occasionally overwhelmed her. And Rebecca cooked his favorite meals, sewed new shirts for him, and continued her reading lessons with renewed enthusiasm. In December, as the Arizona winter brought cool days and cold nights, Marcus asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the fireplace in the house, Rebecca reading aloud from a collection of poetry, when he suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. This was my mother's, he said, holding it up to the firelight. My sister sent it to me along with my inheritance from the ranch. I have been carrying it around for 3 years, not knowing what to do with it, but now I know. It was meant for you, Rebecca. Will you marry me? Rebecca set down the book, her hands shaking slightly. Marriage. It felt both impossibly fast and absolutely right. She had known Marcus for less than 4 months, but in that time he had become essential to her happiness, to her very ability to function. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts, and more importantly, her heart thrived under his care. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear. Yes, I will marry you. They married in January of 1868 in the small church in Gila City. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of neighbors and the local preacher. Rebecca wore a blue dress she had sewn herself, and Marcus wore his best suit, brushed clean of trail dust. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed her with such tenderness that Rebecca felt tears of joy streaming down her face. The ranch became officially theirs together, worked by both of them as equal partners. Marcus proved to be an excellent cattleman, with an eye for breeding stock and a knack for training horses. Under his management, combined with Rebecca's fierce determination and careful planning, the ranch began to prosper. They bought more cattle, expanded their grazing range, and slowly built up a reputation for quality livestock. But it was not just the practical aspects of their partnership that flourished. The love between them grew deeper and stronger with each passing day. Marcus treated Rebecca with consistent respect and affection, never taking her for granted, always mindful of the gift they had been given. And Rebecca, who had once thought she would never smile again after losing Thomas, found herself laughing daily at Marcus's dry humor and gentle teasing. On quiet evenings, they still sat by the fire and read together. But now Rebecca could read on her own, devouring books with enthusiasm. Marcus loved watching her bent over a page, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips moving slightly as she worked through a difficult passage. She had become literate, and with that literacy had come a new confidence that showed in everything she did. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The Arizona Territory was still rough country, with dangers ranging from cattle thieves to Apache raids to the simple, unforgiving harshness of the land itself. But they faced everything together, their partnership making them stronger than either could have been alone. In the spring of 1869, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a touch of anxiety. Rebecca remembered Thomas speaking about wanting children, about the family they would raise together, and for a moment the old grief threatened to overwhelm her. But Marcus held her close and reminded her that this child was a blessing, a symbol of their love and their future. "Thomas would be happy for us," he said gently. "He would want this for you, for us. Do not let guilt steal this joy." Rebecca nodded against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and sage. "I know, and I am happy, truly I am. This baby is a gift." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the hot summer months. Marcus was attentive and protective, insisting that Rebecca rest more and do less physical labor. He hired a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work, despite Rebecca's protests that they could manage on their own. "We can afford it now," he said firmly. "And I am not risking you or the baby by being stubborn." Rebecca finally agreed, touched by his concern even as she chafed slightly at the restrictions. But she used the extra time to improve their home, sewing curtains and quilts, preparing a small room for the baby, and reading every book she could find about childbirth and infant care. On a cool November evening, as the sun was setting over the desert in shades of orange and purple, Rebecca's labor began. Marcus immediately rode into town to fetch the midwife, pushing his horse as fast as he dared. By the time he returned with Mrs. Henderson, an experienced older woman who had delivered half the babies in the territory, Rebecca's contractions were coming hard and fast. Marcus paced outside the bedroom door, his usual calm composure shattered by fear for Rebecca's safety. He had seen men die in the war, had faced death himself more times than he could count, but nothing compared to the terror of knowing Rebecca was in pain, and there was nothing he could do to help her. When he finally heard the sharp, healthy cry of a newborn baby, he nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Henderson opened the door a few minutes later, smiling broadly. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife did wonderfully. Come and meet him." Marcus entered the room to find Rebecca propped up against pillows, her face exhausted but glowing with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face that was somehow the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. As he watched, the infant opened his eyes, revealing dark blue irises that would probably turn brown like his father's. "He is perfect," Marcus whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You are amazing. I am so proud of you." Rebecca smiled up at him, tears of joy and exhaustion streaming down her face. "Would you like to hold him?" Marcus had never held a baby before, but he took his son with careful hands, cradling the small weight against his chest. The infant squirmed slightly, then settled, seeming to instinctively recognize his father's warmth and heartbeat. "We need to name him," Rebecca said softly. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never settled on anything definite. Now, holding his son, Marcus knew exactly what felt right. "I would like to name him Thomas," he said quietly. "After my friend, your first husband, the man who brought us together. Would that be all right with you?" Rebecca's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they were happy tears. "I think that would be perfect. Thomas Marcus Yates." Marcus leaned down to kiss her forehead, careful not to disturb the baby in his arms. "Thomas Marcus Yates," he repeated. "Welcome to the world, son." The years that followed were full and rich. Young Thomas proved to be a healthy, energetic child who toddled after his parents around the ranch as soon as he could walk. He learned to ride before he could properly talk, sitting in front of Marcus on the saddle as they checked the cattle. In 1871, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, a sweet-natured child with her mother's dark hair and her father's brown eyes. 2 years later, another son arrived whom they named James. The house that had once seemed too large and too empty for Rebecca alone was now filled with the noise and chaos and joy of a growing family. The ranch continued to prosper. Marcus's skill with horses led him to start a small breeding program, and soon the Yates Ranch was known throughout the territory for its quality mounts. Rebecca managed the household and the finances with careful precision, her literacy allowing her to keep detailed records and conduct business independently when needed. They hired additional help as the ranch grew, including a young Mexican family who lived in a small house on the far edge of the property. Carlos and Maria Rodriguez became not just employees but friends, their own children playing with Thomas, Sarah, and James while the adults worked together to build something lasting through it all. Rebecca never forgot Thomas Keller, her first husband. She kept his letter in a wooden box on her dresser, and occasionally she would take it out and read it herself, her hard-won literacy allowing her to see his words directly rather than through someone else's voice. Each time she read it, she was struck anew by his generosity, his love for her, and his wisdom in knowing exactly what she would need to move forward. She told her children about him as they grew older, making sure they understood that their family's story was complex and beautiful. Young Thomas was especially fascinated by the man he was named after, asking questions about the war and about what his namesake had been like. "He was brave and kind," Rebecca would tell him. "He loved this ranch and he loved me, and he wanted us to be happy. You carry his name and that is an honor, but you are your own person, with your own path to walk." Marcus, for his part, never showed any jealousy or insecurity about Rebecca's continued love for her first husband. He understood that her heart was large enough to hold both her past and her present, her grief and her joy. And he was secure in the knowledge that she loved him completely, that their marriage was strong and true. In the evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Marcus and Rebecca would sit together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. Sometimes they talked about the future, making plans for the ranch and for their children. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, content in each other's presence. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if I had never come here?" Marcus asked one night, his voice thoughtful. Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I think I would have survived," she said honestly. "I am stronger than I knew back then. But I do not think I would have truly lived. You gave me back my ability to feel joy, Marcus. You gave me a future when all I could see was the past." Marcus pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "You gave me the same thing. I was adrift before I found you, just going through the motions of living. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. Everything good in my life comes from you." "Not from me," Rebecca corrected gently. "From us, from what we have built together." As the years passed, their children grew and thrived. Young Thomas showed his father's talent with horses and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 16, in 1885, he was managing significant portions of the ranch operations. Sarah proved to have a gift for healing, studying with the doctor in Gila City, and eventually becoming a skilled nurse. James, the youngest, had his mother's love of reading and his father's sense of humor, and there was talk of him going to college in the East when he was old enough. The ranch itself had grown from a struggling homestead into one of the most successful operations in southern Arizona. The Yates name was respected throughout the territory, known for fair dealing and quality livestock. Marcus had been asked more than once to run for territorial legislature, but he always declined, preferring the simple satisfaction of working his land with his family. In 1887, on a warm spring day, Rebecca stood in the cemetery in Gila City, placing flowers on Thomas Keller's grave. It had taken her 15 years to make this visit, 15 years to feel strong enough to face this physical reminder of all she had lost and all she had gained. Marcus stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, giving silent support. Their children waited respectfully at a distance, understanding that this was an important moment for their mother. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, speaking to the stone marker but also to the memory of the man who rested beneath it. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me go. Thank you for sending Marcus to me. Thank you for the blessing you gave us. I hope you can see how happy I am, how full my life has become. I will never forget you, Thomas. You will always be part of our family story." She felt Marcus squeeze her hand, felt the solid warmth of him beside her, and knew that she had been blessed twice in one lifetime with love. Not every woman was so fortunate. As they walked back to where their children waited, young Thomas approached and offered his arm to his mother with courtly grace. "Are you all right, Mother?" Rebecca smiled at her eldest son, at this fine young man named after the husband she had lost and raised by the husband she had found. "I am more than all right," she said. "I am blessed beyond measure." The family returned to the ranch together, the wagon rattling over the familiar dirt roads. Rebecca looked around at the landscape she had called home for over 20 years, at the house she and Thomas Keller had built and she and Marcus Yates had expanded, at the children who represented her future, and felt a profound sense of peace. That evening, after supper was finished and the dishes were washed, Marcus found Rebecca standing on the porch, gazing out at the sunset. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how strange life is," Rebecca replied. 20 years ago, I was sitting on these steps, holding a letter I could not read, thinking my life was over. I could not have imagined any of this, the family we have built, the life we have created. If someone had told me then that I would be this happy again, I would not have believed them." "Thomas knew," Marcus said. "He knew you were strong enough to go on, brave enough to love again. He saw in you what I see every day." Rebecca turned in his arms to face him, studying the face she knew as well as her own. There were lines around his eyes now, silver threading through his dark hair, but he was still the same kind, steady man who had ridden up to her ranch on that September day in 1867 and changed everything. "I love you," she said simply, "more than I could ever express in words." "I love you too," Marcus replied, and kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day, on the day each of their children was born, on all the countless ordinary days that had woven together to create their extraordinary life. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, they stood together in the gathering twilight, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of loss and built something beautiful from the ashes of grief. Inside the house, they could hear their children laughing about something, the sound of young voices full of joy and possibility. The ranch stretched out around them, solid and prosperous, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. And in Rebecca's dresser drawer, carefully preserved in its wooden box, Thomas Keller's letter remained, a reminder of the man who had loved her enough to give her permission to live fully, even without him. The years continued to flow gently by, each season bringing its own rhythms and challenges. The Yates Ranch became a fixture in the community, a place known for hospitality as well as quality livestock. Rebecca and Marcus were often called upon to settle disputes or offer advice, their reputation for fairness and wisdom growing with each passing year. In 1889, Arizona was well on its way to becoming a state, and the wild frontier of Rebecca's youth was slowly being tamed. The railroad had come to the territory, bringing with it new opportunities and new challenges. Young Thomas, now 20 years old, had begun talking about expanding their operations, using the railroad to ship cattle to markets back east. Marcus listened to his son's enthusiastic plans with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "The world is changing faster than I ever imagined it could," he said to Rebecca one evening as they prepared for bed. "When I came here in 1867, this was still raw territory. Now there is talk of telephones and electric lights. Our children will live in a very different world than the one we knew." Rebecca sat at her dressing table, brushing out her hair, which still retained its darkness despite a few threads of silver. "Change is not always bad," she said thoughtfully. "Look at how our own lives changed. If I had been too afraid to accept change, to open myself to new possibilities, we would not have this life together." Marcus came up behind her, taking the brush from her hand and gently drawing it through her hair himself, a gesture of intimacy that had become routine over their years together. "You are right, as always. I just hope the changes ahead will be good ones for our children." "They will make their own way," Rebecca said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Just as we did. We have given them strong foundations, good values, and the skills they need. The rest is up to them." True to her words, their children did indeed forge their own paths. Thomas Jr. married in 1891, choosing a practical young woman named Elizabeth from a neighboring ranch. They settled on a portion of the Yates land, building their own house and starting their own herd. Within a year, they had given Marcus and Rebecca their first grandchild, a squalling baby girl named Rebecca after her grandmother. Holding her namesake granddaughter for the first time, Rebecca felt the beautiful continuity of life wash over her. From grief to love to new life, the cycle continued endlessly. She thought about the Rebecca who had sat on the porch steps, unable to read her dead husband's letter, and marveled at how far she had traveled, both literally and figuratively. Sarah chose a different path, moving to Tucson to work at the territorial hospital. She wrote long letters home, filled with descriptions of her work and the diverse patients she treated. Her parents could hear the satisfaction in her words, the sense of purpose that came from helping others. In 1893, she married a doctor she had been working with, a quiet, scholarly man named David, who clearly adored her. James, the youngest, surprised everyone by announcing his intention to become a teacher. He went east to attend college, returning 2 years later with a degree and a passion for education. He took a position at the growing school in Gila City, determined to ensure that children in the territory had access to the learning opportunities his mother had been denied in her own youth. Rebecca was particularly proud of James's choice, understanding that in his own way, he was honoring her journey from illiteracy to literacy, from limitation to possibility. She often visited his classroom, reading to the students or sharing stories about the early days of the territory, becoming something of a living history lesson herself. Through all these changes and milestones, Marcus and Rebecca remained the steady center of their growing family. They still worked the ranch together, though they had gradually turned over more of the daily operations to young Thomas and his wife. They had earned the right to slow down slightly, to spend more time simply enjoying each other's company. On their 25th wedding anniversary in January of 1893, their children threw them a large celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and a table laden with enough food to feed an army. At one point in the evening, Rebecca found herself alone for a moment on the porch, seeking a brief respite from the noise and celebration inside. She looked out at the ranch, at the land she had lived on for over 25 years, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Marcus found her there, as she had known he would. He always seemed to know when she needed him. He wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the January chill and stood beside her, both of them gazing out at their kingdom. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the same question he had asked countless times over the years. "I am thinking about that day you arrived," Rebecca said softly. September 1867. I was sitting right here on these steps, broken and lost, holding a letter I could not read, and you appeared like something out of a dream sent by Thomas to save me. "You did not need saving," Marcus corrected gently. "You needed support, companionship, love. But you would have survived regardless. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Rebecca." "Perhaps," she allowed, "but I would not have thrived the way I have with you. We saved each other, Marcus. We built this life together, this beautiful, full, complicated life. And I would not change a single moment of it." Marcus pulled her close, and they stood there in the cool night air, listening to the sounds of celebration drifting from the house behind them, feeling the weight of 25 years of shared history, of love built on a foundation of loss and rebuilt with patience and devotion. "I have something for you," Marcus said suddenly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I have been working on this for months. I wanted to give you something special for our anniversary." Rebecca took the book and opened it carefully. Inside, in Marcus's careful handwriting, was the story of their life together. He had documented everything, from his first arrival at the ranch to the births of their children to the small, everyday moments that had woven together to create their marriage. There were stories about the early days of the ranch, about funny incidents with the children, about quiet evenings spent reading together. But most movingly, he had copied out Thomas Keller's letter in full, preserving those precious words that had given them both permission to love each other. Tears streamed down Rebecca's face as she read, touched beyond measure by the time and thought Marcus had put into this gift. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "This is our family's history, our legacy. The children and grandchildren will treasure this." I wanted to make sure the story was preserved, Marcus said. I wanted future generations to understand how we came together, how Thomas's generosity and wisdom brought us to each other. And I wanted you to have something you could read yourself, rather than having to rely on someone else to read to you. Rebecca closed the book and held it to her chest, then reached up to kiss her husband. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for everything. You have given me more than I ever dreamed possible." They returned to the celebration together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by friends who had become family over the years. As Rebecca watched Marcus dance with their granddaughter, his face lit with joy, she sent a silent prayer of thanks to Thomas Keller, wherever his spirit might be. He had loved her enough to let her go, and in doing so had given her the most precious gift imaginable. The turn of the century brought more changes. Arizona Territory continued its march toward statehood, becoming increasingly settled and civilized. The ranch adapted to the changing times, incorporating new techniques and technologies while maintaining the core values Marcus and Rebecca had established. In 1901, Rebecca turned 58 years old, and Marcus was 62. They were considered elders of the community now, sought out for advice and respected for their decades of experience. Their children were all settled with families of their own, and the number of grandchildren had grown to 8, with more surely on the way. Rebecca's hair was now more silver than black, and Marcus moved a bit more slowly than he once had, but their love had not diminished with age. If anything, it had deepened and matured, like good wine growing richer over time. They still sat together every evening, still reached for each other in the night, still found joy in simple conversations and shared silences. One spring morning in 1903, Rebecca woke to find Marcus staring at her, propped up on one elbow, a slight smile on his face. "What are you doing?" she asked sleepily. "Just looking at you," he replied, "memorizing every detail. Even after 35 years, I never tire of looking at you." Rebecca laughed and swatted at him playfully. "Flatterer, I am an old woman now. You are beautiful," Marcus insisted. "More beautiful than the day I met you, because now I can see all the years in your face, all the love and laughter and life we have shared. Every line tells a story, and I treasure them all." Later that day, as Rebecca worked in her garden, she reflected on his words. She had lived so much life, experienced so much joy and sorrow, that it seemed impossible it had all fit into one existence. The frightened young widow who could not read her husband's final letter felt like a different person entirely. Though Rebecca knew she still carried that woman inside her, along with all the other versions of herself she had been over the years. That evening, she retrieved Thomas Keller's letter from its box and read it again, as she did occasionally when she needed to remember her journey. The paper was yellowed now, the ink faded, but the words remained as powerful as ever. She thought about how this letter had changed her life, how one man's wisdom and love had rippled out to affect not just her but Marcus and their children and grandchildren, and everyone they had touched over the years. As if summoned by her thoughts, Marcus appeared in the doorway of their bedroom. "Reading the letter?" he asked softly. "I was just thinking about how one moment can change everything," Rebecca replied. "If you had not offered to read this to me that first day, if you had not held me while I wept, if we had not taken that first step toward each other, none of this would exist. Our children, our grandchildren, the life we have built, all of it stems from that moment on the porch." Marcus sat beside her on the bed, taking the letter gently from her hands and reading it himself. He had read it many times over the years, always moved by his friend's words, always grateful for the blessing Thomas had given them. "Thomas was a wise man," Marcus said, "and a generous one. He understood something profound about love and loss that many people never grasp. He knew that loving you did not require keeping you frozen in grief. He loved you enough to want you to live fully, even without him. "I hope I have honored that," Rebecca said quietly. "I hope he would be proud of the life I have lived." "He would be proud beyond measure," Marcus assured her. "As am I." In the years that followed, as Arizona finally achieved statehood in 1912, Rebecca and Marcus gradually stepped back from active ranch management, ceding full control to young Thomas and his sons. They remained on the ranch, of course, in the house they had shared for so many decades. But their days were now filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with reading and quiet conversation, with the simple pleasures of a life well lived. Rebecca continued to read voraciously, her love of learning never diminishing. She read newspapers and magazines, keeping up with the rapidly changing world. She read novels and poetry, history and biography. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she would read aloud to Marcus, just as Thomas Keller had once read aloud to her, the sound of her voice filling their home with warmth and companionship. On a warm September day in 1917, exactly 50 years after Marcus had first ridden up to the ranch, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. Rebecca was 74 now, Marcus 78, both of them showing the marks of their long, full lives. But their hands were still clasped together, their love still as evident as it had been on their wedding day. 50 years, Rebecca mused. "Can you believe it has been 50 years since you arrived here?" "It feels like yesterday," Marcus replied, "and also like a lifetime ago." "We were different people then." "We were," Rebecca agreed. "Younger, sadder, more lost, but we found each other and we found our way home." Marcus turned to look at her, his brown eyes still warm and kind despite the passage of decades. "You have been the great adventure of my life, Rebecca. Every day with you has been a gift." "And you have been mine," she replied. "You gave me back my ability to love, to hope, to dream. You gave me everything that matters." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant colors. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, with the sounds of their descendants going about their evening chores, with the lowing of cattle and the nickering of horses, with all the familiar rhythms that had structured their days for half a century. Inside the house, in Rebecca's dresser drawer, Thomas Keller's letter remained in its wooden box, carefully preserved. And on the shelf beside it was Marcus's handwritten book, chronicling their life together, a testament to the love that had grown from grief and loss into something beautiful and enduring. As darkness fell, and the stars emerged one by one in the vast western sky, Marcus and Rebecca rose slowly and made their way inside, supporting each other as they had always done, partners in every sense of the word. Behind them, the land they had worked and loved stretched out into the night, solid and eternal, a legacy for the generations that would follow. The years continued their inexorable march. Marcus and Rebecca grew older but never apart, their bond strengthening even as their bodies weakened. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, welcomed new great-grandchildren, and mourned friends who passed on. Through it all, they remained each other's constant, the center around which their large family orbited. In the spring of 1920, Marcus fell ill with pneumonia. Rebecca nursed him tirelessly, sitting by his bedside day and night, refusing to leave his side. Their children urged her to rest, to let them take over, but she was adamant. "I have had 53 years with this man," she told them firmly. "I will not waste a single moment of whatever time we have left." Marcus recovered, though the illness left him frailer than before. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, but his mind remained sharp and his love for Rebecca undiminished. They spent long hours together, reminiscing about their life, telling stories to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren about the early days of the territory. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden Rebecca had tended for decades, young Thomas's great-grandson, a boy of 8 also named Thomas, approached them with a question. "Great-grandmother," he said, climbing onto Rebecca's lap despite being almost too big for such things, "why do you and great-grandfather love each other so much? My friend Billy says old people do not really love anymore." Rebecca exchanged an amused glance with Marcus before answering. "Your friend Billy does not know what he is talking about," she said gently. "Love does not stop when you get old. If anything, it gets stronger because you have more memories, more shared experiences. Your great-grandfather and I have loved each other for over 50 years, and I love him more today than I did the day we married." "But how did you know?" the boy persisted. "How did you know he was the right person?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I think I knew because he made me want to keep living even when I thought I could not go on. He was kind when I needed kindness, strong when I needed strength, and patient when I needed time. He loved me not despite my flaws but including them, and he gave me the freedom to be fully myself." Marcus reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "And your great-grandmother taught me that home is not a place, it is a person. She showed me that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that taking a chance on happiness is always worth the risk." The boy looked between them, seeming to sense the depth of what he was hearing even if he did not fully understand it yet. "I hope I find someone to love like that," he said seriously. "I hope you do too," Rebecca replied, kissing the top of his head. "And when you do, remember to hold onto them tightly and never take them for granted." As the boy scampered off to play, Marcus chuckled softly. "Do you think he understood any of that?" "Probably not," Rebecca admitted. "But maybe someday he will remember this conversation, and it will mean something to him." They sat quietly for a while, hands clasped, watching the activity of the ranch around them. The world had changed so much since they had first come together. There were automobiles now instead of horses for transportation, though the ranch still kept plenty of horses for working cattle. There was electricity and telephones, and talk of something called radio that would let people hear voices from far away. The wild frontier of their youth had been thoroughly tamed, transformed into a modern state, but some things never changed. The land itself remained, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. The work of ranching continued, requiring the same dedication and hard work it always had. And love, real love, remained as powerful and necessary as ever. In the fall of 1922, as Rebecca was approaching her 80th birthday, Marcus's health took a serious turn. He had been declining gradually for months, his body simply wearing out after a long, hard working life. The doctor was frank with Rebecca. Marcus did not have much time left. Rebecca took the news with outward calm, though inside her heart was breaking. She had always known this day would come, had known that eventually she would have to say goodbye to this man who had been her rock for over half a century. But knowing it intellectually and facing it emotionally were two very different things. She moved a chair beside his bed and rarely left it, reading to him when he was awake, holding his hand when he slept. Their children and grandchildren came to say their goodbyes, and Marcus had words of wisdom and love for each of them. But mostly, he wanted to be with Rebecca. One evening in late October, as the Arizona air finally began to cool after the brutal summer, Marcus squeezed Rebecca's hand to get her attention. She set down the book she had been reading and leaned close to hear him. "No regrets," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "I want you to know that, not a single regret about any of it." "I know," Rebecca replied, tears streaming down her face. "I do not have any regrets either. You gave me an incredible life, Marcus. You gave me everything." "Thomas was right," Marcus continued. "Love is not finite. You loved him and you loved me, and there was room for both. Remember that now. Do not spend the rest of your time drowning in grief. Honor me by living fully, by finding joy where you can." Rebecca let out a sob, recognizing Thomas Keller's words echoed in her second husband's final message. History was repeating itself, but this time she was older, hopefully wiser, and had a large family to sustain her. "I will try," she promised, "but it will be so hard without you." "You are strong," Marcus said, his eyes holding hers with fierce intensity despite his weakness. "Stronger than you know. You survived losing Thomas, you will survive losing me, and I will be waiting for you whenever you are ready to join me." He drifted off to sleep then, and Rebecca sat watching him breathe, memorizing every detail of his beloved face. She thought about the cowboy who had ridden up to her ranch 55 years earlier, who had read her dead husband's letter aloud and held her while she wept, who had stayed and built a life with her more beautiful than she had ever imagined possible. Marcus Yates died peacefully in his sleep 2 days later, with Rebecca holding his hand, and their entire family gathered around him. He was 83 years old and had lived a full, rich life surrounded by love. The funeral was the largest Gila City had ever seen. People came from all over Arizona to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and loved throughout the territory. Rebecca stood between her children, accepting condolences with dignity, her grief held in check by sheer force of will. It was only later, alone in the house she had shared with Marcus for over 50 years, that she finally allowed herself to break down completely. She sat on their bed, clutching one of his shirts that still smelled like him, and wept as she had not wept since the day Marcus had read her Thomas's letter all those decades ago. But even in her grief, Rebecca knew she would survive. She had done it before, and she would do it again. Marcus had taught her that love was worth the pain of loss, that connection was worth the risk of heartbreak. She had been blessed to love deeply twice in her life, and she would not dishonor either man's memory by giving up now. The days and weeks that followed were difficult. Rebecca moved through them mechanically at first, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. But gradually, supported by her large family and sustained by her memories, she began to find her footing again. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, finding joy in their youth and energy. She continued to read voraciously, her mind as sharp as ever despite her advanced age. And she began writing, adding her own perspective to the book Marcus had started, ensuring that their full story was preserved for future generations. On what would have been their 55th wedding anniversary, Rebecca took both of her letters, Thomas's original and Marcus's handwritten book, and read through them both. She cried, as she always did, but they were not only tears of grief. They were also tears of gratitude for the extraordinary life she had lived, for the 2 exceptional men who had loved her, for the family they had created together. She thought about the terrified young widow who had not been able to read her dead husband's final words, and about the cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray. She thought about 53 years of marriage, of partnership, of love that had sustained them through everything life threw at them, and she made a decision. She would not simply survive the rest of her days, she would live them. She would honor both Thomas and Marcus by embracing whatever time she had left, by finding meaning and purpose and joy wherever possible. That was what they both had wanted for her, and she would give them that gift. Rebecca Yates lived another 8 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. She died peacefully in her sleep in March of 1930, at the age of 87, surrounded by 4 generations of descendants. She was buried beside Marcus in the cemetery in Gila City, not far from where Thomas Keller rested. At her funeral, her grandson James, now a distinguished educator and grandfather himself, stood to speak about his grandmother's remarkable life. He told the story of how she had overcome illiteracy to become one of the most well-read people in the territory. He talked about her strength and resilience, her capacity for love, her wisdom and grace. But most movingly, he read from both Thomas Keller's letter and Marcus Yates's book, sharing with everyone the love story that had defined his grandmother's life. He spoke of how one moment of kindness, one act of compassion from a cowboy reading a letter aloud to a grieving widow, had changed everything. He talked about how love could grow from loss, how happiness could emerge from heartbreak, how one life could be blessed with 2 great loves. My grandmother taught us that love is not something to be feared or avoided because of the pain it might bring, he concluded. She showed us that taking the risk, opening your heart despite the possibility of loss, is always worth it. She loved deeply twice, lost deeply twice, and still considered herself the most fortunate of women. That is the legacy she leaves us. That is the lesson we should all take from her remarkable life. As the family gathered at the ranch after the funeral, young Thomas's great-great-grandson, another Thomas in the long line of boys named after the first Thomas Keller, found the wooden box in his great-great-grandmother's room. Inside were the 2 letters, along with a note in Rebecca's own handwriting. To whoever finds this, the note read, these letters represent the foundation of our family. Thomas Keller loved me enough to let me go, and Marcus Yates loved me enough to help me live again. I have had an extraordinary life because 2 exceptional men had the courage and wisdom to put my happiness above their own egos or insecurities. Pass these letters down through the generations. Let them remind our descendants that love is always worth the risk, that grief is the price we pay for connection, and that the human heart has an infinite capacity to heal and love again. I go now to join my husbands, grateful beyond measure for every moment I was given with each of them. Live fully, love deeply, and never take a single day for granted. That is all anyone can do, and it is everything. With love to all my descendants, Rebecca. The letters were indeed passed down through the generations, becoming treasured family heirlooms. The story of Rebecca and her 2 husbands became part of family lore, told and retold to each new generation. The ranch itself remained in the family, still bearing the Yates name, still raising cattle and horses as it had for over a century. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever comes after this life, 3 souls found each other again, no longer separated by death or time or circumstance, united in the love that had sustained them all and in gratitude for the beautiful, complicated, perfect life they had shared. The wild west of their youth was long gone, transformed into modern Arizona with its cities and highways and all the trappings of the 20th century. But the legacy of that earlier time remained in families like the Yates, in the values they had carried forward, in the stories they preserved and passed down. The courage, the resilience, the capacity for love in the face of loss, these timeless qualities transcended any particular era. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that Rebecca had learned on a September day in 1867, when a kind cowboy had read her dead husband's letter aloud and held her while she wept. That love, real love, never dies. It transforms, it evolves, it grows in new directions, but it never truly ends. It ripples out through generations, touching lives far into the future, a precious gift passed down from those who came before. That was Rebecca's legacy. That was the gift she left to all who came after her. The knowledge that the human heart is far stronger and far more expansive than we ever imagine. And that even in our darkest moments, when all seems lost, there is always the possibility of hope, of healing, of love finding us again when we need it most.